Chapter 13 deals with the anatomy of the nervous system. So with the central nervous system, this is comprised of both the spinal cord and the brain. And in the brain, we do have subdivisions or parts of it: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon. We're going to be looking at all of these in greater detail. We're going to start with the cerebrum. This is the largest portion of the brain. It composes about 80% of the mass of the brain. It is divided into two hemispheres that are referred to as your cerebral hemispheres. Those two hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure. The corpus callosum is the group of axons that does connect the two cerebral hemispheres to each other. With the brain, and certainly in the cerebrum, one of the physical characteristics that we notice is that the gray matter is on the surface and the white matter is deep. Very generally speaking, overall, the cerebrum is responsible for your higher cognitive functions, memory, and emotions. So if we look at the diagram of the cerebrum, then as I get my laser pointer ready over here, from a lateral view here, you can see this portion here is the cerebrum. You can see this dotted outline is showing where the corpus callosum would be, connecting the two hemispheres together. So if we look at the anterior view, we have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. This is that longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres, one from the other. Within the cerebrum, we have deep within the cerebrum areas that are known as the basal nuclei, the basal forebrain, and the limbic cortex. Each of these have specific functions. In general, the basal nuclei are responsible for a lot of the cognitive processing information. And then the basal forebrains with learning and your memory. The limbic cortex, this involves a lot of memory as well, behavior aspects, and emotions. The cerebral cortex, remember cortex is always on the surface, the outermost area. So the cerebral cortex, you notice we're going to give different names. There's a lot of ridges that are known as the gyrus, and the grooves are the sulcus. This increases the surface area tremendously instead of just being a flat surface. And you tend to see that throughout anatomy and physiology, that whenever you want to increase surface area to increase whatever process is occurring there, instead of a flat surface, it tends to have all these indentations and grooves because that does increase that surface area. The brain, the cerebrum itself, is divided into different lobes or different sections. There are 4 lobes. Some books you will see a 5th lobe. We'll go with what this textbook is using, which is 4 lobes: the temporal, parietal, frontal, and occipital. And you can probably guess by their names where they're going to be located. So as you can see here, it's color-coded, this kind of pinkish red color. This is the frontal lobe. You have the parietal lobe, you have the temporal lobe, and then the occipital lobe. Once again, that's why I always stress the very beginning of A&P is to learn those different anatomical regions and term names, because they come back again and again. Now with the cerebral cortex, different areas in general, there are some specific things, but in general have certain different functions. So if you look behind that central sulcus, so posterior to it is the parietal lobe. And in the parietal lobe tends to be mostly associated with different sensations. In front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobe, and that tends to be more motor type functions. The very front part of the frontal lobe, which is known as the prefrontal area, that is associated with some of your personality, behavior things. So personality, short-term memory, consciousness tends to be located there. The temporal lobe has most of your auditory functions, and the occipital lobe has a lot of the visual functions. But like I said, this is just a very generalization because you do have other functions, obviously, within each of the lobes as well. A couple things I want to point out is the hemispheres are not identical. So if you were to look at the frontal lobe on the left side versus the right side, they're not necessarily identical. A lot of things will be the same, but they're not exactly identical. To give you an example of that, there are two areas that have been well studied: the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. The Broca region or Broca's area is found in the frontal lobe, but it's only on the left side. And the function of it is with the production of language for speaking. The Wernicke area, which is also only on the left side of the temporal lobe, that is responsible for comprehension of language. So the other thing, as we study more and more about the brain and the physiology and where things are located on it, is we find that, yes, it makes sense when you stop and think about it. Not everything's located in the same spot. In other words, for speech, for language, you don't have everything located for understanding and producing language, producing speech in the same area, which kind of makes sense. So that if you had damage to one area of the brain, it's not going to completely, say, wipe out your ability to speak and understand language. And so in the Wernicke area, if that area were to be damaged, an individual could still speak, but they wouldn't understand what you were saying. Versus if the Broca's area was damaged, but the Wernicke area is fine, you could understand the language, but you would have problems putting into words and actually speaking. I actually have a cousin who has a child that has some issues. Then they've been able to isolate that it's the Broca's area which does not function properly for him. He can understand what you're saying, but he cannot speak. He can speak a little bit, but not much. And so it was very interesting as a young child when they first realized he was not speaking verbally, as soon as their other children had, and they started taking him to a doctor and trying to figure out what was going on. But they could see that he was kind of struggling, like he knew what he wanted to say, but he couldn't speak. And so they taught him sign language, and that was a huge benefit to him. And that also helped the doctors and all to try to figure out, okay, which area of the brain has been affected, because he can communicate just fine through sign language. So he understands what you're saying, but he can't put it in just the spoken words. And it just gives an idea, once again, as to how complex the brain is. And I'm always reminded of a phrase I heard years and years ago. It was actually when I was in grade school, of the more you know you don't know. Kind of the thing, for every question you try to answer, it brings up 20 more questions. And then 20 questions beyond that, etc. So, I mean, we're making a huge amount of headway, but do we know exactly what every tiny region of the brain, what its function is? No, we don't. There's a lot we don't know. And so this picture I put in because it's kind of an interesting picture, I think, of showing, like I said, this prefrontal area. So this is the front, this is the back. All of this colored area is the cerebrum. This prefrontal area has a lot to do with behavior, personality, things like that. You have mostly motor functions in this frontal area, and then sensory areas behind here. Olfactory, that is smell, and auditory is going to be in the temporal region over here as well. And here's that Wernicke area I was talking about. In the occipital lobe, you have your vision areas primarily. The limbic, remember, that is also with emotion. So it just gives you a general feel of where things are located. And this can be helpful if someone were to have a brain injury, say in the frontal area, that might affect more of their ability to respond in terms of movement. They might feel pain, but can they move their leg? Maybe not. If damage is back here, it's going to be more the sensory. So it's kind of like there's a dividing line right here, that central sulcus, which is in the front is motor, and the back is sensory. Very generalized. As you move deeper from the surface, so out of that cortical cortex area, you're still in the cerebrum. Moving to the subcortical structures, you have the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is both involved with emotions, long-term memory. Long-term memory and short-term memory tend to be in different places. Your basal nuclei, this is going to help with receiving certain information and overall knowing the general state of the person and making those fine-tuned adjustments that you need to make. And this is just showing some of these, and when we talk about the basal nuclei, they're divided into these different components in here. And just to give you another perspective of when we're talking about the cortex area, more on the surface up here, you see the cerebral cortex. And then as you go deeper, this dark blue coloration here is the basal ganglia. Here's your corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres together. And then down here, the amygdala, and then this dark blue right over here is the hippocampus. And then from the side here, you've got also your two hemispheres, once again, just to give you some perspective. The diencephalon connects the cerebrum with other parts of the brain and eventually to the spinal cord. It's composed of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, also the epithalamus, which includes your pineal gland. We'll study that with the endocrine system. Just right now, I'll let you know that it does secrete the melatonin. Like I said, we'll study it with the endocrine system, and that's one thing that you're going to find. The hypothalamus is also associated with the endocrine system. So you can have some of these components that are part of the nervous system, but also part of the endocrine system or another system. They're not isolated just to one component. And so with the diencephalon, as we can see, that is deeper in, here's your cerebrum. It's below it, kind of embedded in it. So this kind of oval-shaped structure that's green right here, this is the thalamus. The hypothalamus, if you're trying to remember, oh, how am I going to remember where these things are? Okay, the thalamus is oval-shaped. Hypo means below. So the hypothalamus is right beneath it. Sticking off, connected to the hypothalamus, is your pituitary gland. You're going to see that again also when we study the endocrine system. And that pineal gland that I mentioned, that's this little knob right over here, tucked under the thalamus. So what does the thalamus do? Well, it's a relay station. So any information that's coming from other areas of the brain, the spinal cord, that has to go up to the cerebrum has to pass through the thalamus. And any information from the cerebrum, say to send information back down to the spinal cord, has to pass through the thalamus. So it's going to help process information as it's passing through, but think of it as the relay station. The hypothalamus is very, very important in helping to regulate and control homeostasis. It's receiving a lot of information from throughout the body as to things such as internal temperature, blood pH, blood carbon dioxide levels, sodium levels, potassium levels, heart rate, respiration rate, all of that. And so it's helping to control. It's the kind of control center in terms of maintaining that homeostatic balance. It is involved with the autonomic nervous system, so you don't have control over it. It is involved with the endocrine system in that it does actually produce a couple of hormones, and then it also regulates the release of other hormones from some of your other endocrine glands. It's also involved with the limbic system, which, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with memory and emotions. So the hypothalamus is a perfect example of something that has basically multiple jobs, multiple hats that it has to wear. It's involved in many different systems, and you see that interconnection then between the systems. The brainstem is composed of three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, or the full name is medulla oblongata. The brainstem does connect the brain to the spinal cord. And so if we look at it here, remember here's your diencephalon, your thalamus, hypothalamus. This is the cerebrum. So here is the midbrain, and then right below it is the pons. It kind of looks like a swelling. And then right below the pons is the medulla. And so below the medulla right here would be the spinal cord. So the midbrain, its purpose, and once again, generally speaking, is to help coordinate a lot of sensory information that's coming in from visual, auditory, and your somatic sensory perception, coordinating all of that. What do you see with what you're hearing, etc. The pons is helping basically connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. And the medulla connects the brain to the spinal cord. The brainstem in general, all three of these components do help regulate. They're basically control centers. They help to regulate the cardiovascular and respiratory system. So they're going to be involved with helping to regulate your respiration rate, your heart rate, and things like that. Which is one reason why any trauma, any damage to the brainstem, anywhere on the brain is going to be devastating, but certainly to the brainstem, depending on the area, because this is the relay station, it also regulates those important things such as heart rate, respiration rate. It would be absolutely devastating. The cerebellum is going to be taking information from the cerebrum, and it's also getting information from the peripheral nerves, and all this sensory information. It's trying to get all this information in and help to coordinate the movements. So it's kind of like you're getting the visual information, you're getting sensory information in terms of touch, you're getting sound, everything, and you're having to coordinate movement of muscles. Well, do you want a jerky movement? Do you want a nice smooth movement? So it's the cerebellum is helping to coordinate everything, fine tune and adjust everything. One thing that is classic that you see with the cerebellum is that the white matter that is deeper, just like elsewhere in the brain, that the gray matter is on the surface and the white matter is internal. With the cerebellum, that white matter we call the arbor vitae. That is Latin for tree of life. And when you do a dissection and you look at it, it actually does look like kind of a tree and all the branching from it. And so in the schematic diagram, but when you actually do a dissection, and in the lab portion where you have videos of looking at brain dissections, you will see that this white matter truly is white and has all that little branching, just like, oh, here's the trunk and the larger branches and the smaller ones off of it, and then the twigs. It actually looks like that. And so you can see how anything from the cerebellum, excuse me, the information is going to go to the brainstem and then up to the cerebrum or down to the spinal cord. The spinal cord, in general, the posterior regions are sensory, the anterior regions are motor. Now we see a switch. Remember in the brain, the gray matter was on the superficial layers and the white matter was internal? It's reversed with the spinal cord. The gray matter is deeper and the white matter is superficial. We divide the spinal cord into different regions, the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. When we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord and we look at the white versus the gray area we refer to as horns. It kind of resembles a butterfly in the shape of it. So those horns or those regions are divided themselves on each side of the butterfly, if you will, into three parts. There's the posterior horn, the anterior horn, and the lateral horn. Now the posterior horn is containing all sensory processing information. The anterior horn is going to be containing motor impulses that are going to be ultimately sent to skeletal muscles. And the lateral horn involves the sympathetic nervous division. Excuse me. So in this is an actual picture of spinal cord, and here's a schematic drawing of it, but you can see it looks like a butterfly, and one half is like a mirror image of the other half. So this would be the gray matter. In the very middle is the central canal. Cerebrospinal fluid will be flowing through here, which we talk about at the end of this chapter. It's helping to remove waste products. You also have cerebral spinal fluid flushing around the outer surface of the spinal cord. So here is the anterior or ventral horn. Here is the posterior, also known as the dorsal horn, and then the lateral horn over here. And then this is white matter along the sides of it. The white matter is known as columns. So there's a posterior column that tends to contain what we refer to as ascending tracts, because tracts is a group of axons. It's sensory, containing sensory information. It is headed towards the brain. The anterior column contains mixed tracts, meaning it has both sensory and motor. And then the lateral column also is mixed, that it also contains sensory and motor. Sensory is bringing that information to the brain. Motor is taking information from the brain, heading back down. One thing I do want to mention about the spinal cord versus the brain, the axons, as they travel up to the brain, there are a couple different locations where they do cross over. In other words, yes, it is true that the right side of the brain is receiving information from the left side of the body, and the left brain is receiving information from the right side of the body. And that can be very important from a medical standpoint, or just even general applications. If you have an individual that, one of the classic examples is if you suspect someone's having a stroke, if they cannot move, say, their right arm, that tells you that the problem is on the left side of the brain. So yes, it is true, it's the opposite side because those axons cross over. When we look at the blood supply to the brain, obviously the brain is a very sensitive tissue, very fragile tissue, and very important. It's controlling and running everything for your survival. So it's very important that this tissue that is so important has to have an uninterrupted supply of blood. That blood is carrying nutrients, it's carrying oxygen, it's going to be removing waste products, and so you have to have a very good supply. It needs to be dedicated to the brain. It needs to be ensured that There's not going to be a break in that supply train, if you will. So what we notice at the brain is that there's actually multiple routes of getting blood to the brain. And this is very important to ensure survival, essentially. With the brain, there's also what we call the blood-brain barrier. Basically, there's a method in place so that the blood, in the rest of the body, the blood travels, and through the arteries, when it gets to the capillaries, the nutrients can diffuse out, the oxygen can diffuse out, and waste products and carbon dioxide, that's considered a waste product, they diffuse back into the blood. But these chemicals are able to just freely diffuse out of the blood into the interstitial fluid, the fluid that's between the cells. There's no filtration method at that point. You don't want that to happen in the brain, because anything you take in the body, it's going to end up in the blood. You don't want toxins, you don't want pathogens to be able to freely diffuse from the blood and onto the brain tissue. So the blood-brain barrier, it's a mechanism by which essentially it's like a filter. So substances do not just freely pass out of the blood into the fluid around the brain. It has to be filtered, and this is a protective mechanism. Well, how do you get the blood supply to the brain? Well, I said there's multiple routes. Your external carotid arteries tend to supply your superficial tissues of the cranium. The internal carotid arteries are going to enter the cranium through the carotid canal, so they will be able, as the name implies, supply blood internally. The vertebral arteries also are going to move up, and they're going to move up through the foramen magnum. That's essentially the opening at the base of the skull. It allows the spinal cord to connect to the brain, but it also allows some of these arteries to also enter from a different location than your internal carotid arteries. You don't want all the blood arriving and entering in at the same spot. You want it to be able to come in at multiple areas. Now, both your internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries, once they're internal inside the cranium, they will eventually come together and they form what's known as the circle of Willis. This purpose of this is that it will supply a constant supply of blood, even if one of the vessels gets compromised. If one of them narrows or gets a blockage to it, you will still be able to get blood to the brain for survival purposes. So first off, this is showing as we come up along here, the carotid. Then the external carotid, as I said, that is going to supply superficially. So on the outside of the cranial bones. It's supplying the muscles, it's supplying the skin, etc. So that would be up this way. Now here you have a branching, if you will. So this is the external. The other one is the internal, and it's going to move, as you can see, right in here through the carotid foramen and go internal, and now supply the brain inside. And then you've got, so down here's your aorta. Here's your brachiocephalic artery. This is your common carotid. Right here is where you have the branching off and the vertebral artery. Notice it is going up, and it's going to go as we said, through the foramen magnum. This circle of Willis that I had mentioned, here is your internal carotid right here, and here's your vertebral artery right here. And see how they come together, and this is right here, your circle of Willis. If you were to have a blockage here, or even a blockage on this internal carotid right here, you are still able to get blood to these areas because you're still having the blood coming in this way. You still have blood coming in this way. So like I said, if you were to have a blockage or narrowing or any type of way that that blood vessel is compromised, you are not going to lose all this tissue in this area. It's very much like a safety net or a protective thing to ensure that you will still get blood to the brain. So how does the blood return? Well, the venous return, the blood's going to return to circulation. It's by a series of dural sinuses and veins. So what happens, and we'll get a little bit more detail of this when we talk about the cerebrospinal fluid, but basically the blood is coming in. You gradually have the arteries getting smaller and smaller, as they're feeding the tissue. As I said a bit ago, there is kind of the filtration method. It involves what we call the choroid plexus, or the cerebrospinal fluid basically is formed by filtering the blood. It does not allow certain proteins out, it does not allow toxins out, it does not allow pathogens to leave the blood vessel, so that stays in the blood. But the fluid that does diffuse out, which contains the nutrients that the cells need, it contains the oxygen, etc., that the cells need. This is what comprises your cerebrospinal fluid. And that is going to be flowing, as I said at the end of this chapter, we're going to talk about the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid as it essentially bathes the brain and the spinal cord. Well, that fluid, you produce about 500 mils of it a day. It's constantly circulating, and you constantly are producing more, and part of it goes out of circulation because you've got to return some of that fluid back to the blood. You want to always try to maintain a constant blood volume. So if you have liquid coming out of the blood, you have to return that to the blood. So how do you do that? You have what we call these sinuses, several of them. In the next, I have a picture next that may help clarify this. But you have several of these different sinuses, the occipital, the superior sagittal. By the name, you can kind of figure out where they're at. And the straight sinus, they all converge together, and they're going to drain into what's known as the transverse sinus. That, in turn, is going to drain into the sigmoid sinus, which eventually it drains into your jugular veins. Once it's in the jugular veins, okay, you're back in the cardiovascular vessels, and it's going to be, the veins will return the blood to the heart. So, like we said, for the fluid leaves the blood in the arteries, forming the cerebrospinal fluid. How do you get it back? Well, here's your superior sagittal sinus, here's the inferior sagittal sinus. And you see this is all going to start to flow towards the back along here. Here's a straight sinus. So your inferior drains into the straight. Here you go. They all converge right here. Down here's your occipital sinus drains. They're all converging at this point, and now here's your transverse sinus here. And it's going to drain into the sigmoid sinus and eventually into the jugular vein, which then eventually is going to drain back to the heart. Once again, you have the spinal cord and the brain, very fragile, very important tissues, obviously. You want as much protection as you can around it. So there is some connective tissue membranes that are known as the meninges that do cover both the spinal cord and the brain. They're helping to provide additional protection with it. They are 3 layers thick. The outermost layer is known as the dura mater. It is directly attached to the bone. So for the spinal cord, it's directly going to be attached to the vertebrae, and in the brain, it's going to be attached to the inner surface of your cranial bones. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater. This is going to be involved with helping to reabsorb that cerebrospinal fluid, as we just saw on the sides. And then the pia mater is the innermost layer. It's very thin, and it is attached directly to the brain and to the spinal cord. And so in this drawing here, you can see you've got the bone. Here is your dura mater. You have a little bit of space called the subdural space, and then you have the arachnoid mater. And then the innermost layer is going to be the pia mater, and then here's the brain right here. So the pia mater is literally right on top of the brain. It is attached there. Now, in this wide space right here, that is your subarachnoid space. So here's your pia mater, here's your arachnoid layer, mater, the middle layer. In this subarachnoid space is where your cerebrospinal fluid is. And so what happens is, as we said earlier, in the brain, you've got a nice blood supply. The arteries are all in through here. The nutrients, the gases are able to be filtered. They are going to supply the nutrients and gases to this very active tissue of the brain. In the subarachnoid space, the cerebrospinal fluid, you have these little indentations here that are known as the arachnoid granulation villi, the little extensions into the dura mater. As the cerebrospinal fluid flows in here, that's where it's going to pass and be reabsorbed. So right here, the blue is the superior sagittal sinus. The sinuses are in the dura mater. And so when we talk about how those sinuses were collecting the cerebrospinal fluid, how did they get it? They got it from the arachnoid granulations right here. So outermost layer is the dura mater. You have the subdural space, you have the arachnoid layer, and then the pia mater layer is the innermost. And so just to try to give you that perspective of the layers, once again, outermost you've got the bone. With the spinal cord in the vertebral column, you have the epidural space. You don't see that as much. You could expand, but you don't see it as much in the brain. There's just not room. But in the vertebral column, between the bone and the dura mater, there is space, and that's known as epidural space. If you receive an epidural, that's where they're going to inject the medication. The anesthesia typically is what we're talking about. So you have your dura mater. Then you have your subdural space. Then you have your arachnoid mater. So in the subdural space is where you are picking up the sinuses for the venous return. The subarachnoid space underneath the arachnoid mater is where the cerebrospinal fluid is. Then your pia mater, and then your brain or your spinal cord, depending on which place you're talking about. And this is just another drawing to kind of indicate, once again, here is your brain tissue. Here is your pia mater. Here is your subarachnoid space that contains your cerebrospinal fluid. Here's the arachnoid mater, your dura mater, the bone, and then ultimately the skin. So if they need to do a spinal tap, what they're trying to do is get a sample of your cerebrospinal fluid. So they're going to have to go to the subarachnoid space here. As I always say, that's pretty close. Now they're going to do it with the spinal cord, obviously, not the brain, but still, it's really close there. So be still. The ventricular system refers to the ventricles, or the open chambers in the brain, and the cerebrospinal fluid and how they work together. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to be produced and flow through these ventricles from one to another. There's 4 ventricles in the brain, and then ultimately it's also going to then circulate around the spinal cord as well. And the purpose of it, like I said, you have filtered the blood, and now you need to remove any waste products and return that waste to the blood, return that fluid to the blood Cerebrospinal fluid is also going to act kind of like a shock absorber. It acts to cushion both the brain and the spinal cord. And one example of showing this, I often say, is if you were to take a hard-boiled egg and put it in a jar and say, okay, this is your brain. And the jar, the sides of the jar are like the bones of the skull. And if you were to shake that, the egg's going to start to break up a bit. But if you fill the jar with water and then put the egg in, that water acts as a cushion. It absorbs a lot of the force whenever there's a blow. And that's what happens when you get like a blow to the head. The cerebral spinal fluid as a fluid is absorbing a lot of that pressure, a lot of that force. And so the trauma is less. Now, obviously, you still can have trauma, but without cerebral spinal fluid in there, it would be much, much worse as far as the damage. So these four ventricles, there's a right lateral ventricle, that's going to be within the cerebrum. There's a left lateral ventricle, which is also within the cerebrum. So those are the first two. The third ventricle is named third ventricle, and it's within the diencephalon. It is going to be connected to both of those lateral ventricles by what we call the interventricular foramen. Kind of makes sense. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So your four ventricles are the right lateral, the left lateral, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So once I mean, for once the names are kind of logical. The fourth ventricle is between the cerebellum and the pons in the upper medulla. The cerebral spinal fluid is going to be produced by specialized epidermal cells. Remember, those are some of your glial cells of the central nervous system. They're located in the choroid plexus, and it produces the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, by filtering that blood, as I've said. So how does the cerebral spinal fluid flow? Well, it tends to be made by these choroid plexus. Some of them are located in the lateral ventricles, both the right and the left. And so that central CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, is produced by the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles. It's going to flow from there to the third ventricle where there's additional choroid plexus, so you can make additional CSF. From the third ventricle, it's going to flow to the fourth ventricle where there's a few more choroid plexus, so you're producing a little bit even more additional CSF. From there, there's a couple of options. The majority of it is going to flow down the central canal, the spinal cord, but some of it can also leave through some spaces to be able to flow in the subarachnoid space around the brain. And then it's going to be reabsorbed by the arachnoid granulations, those indentations into the dura mater. And so it's reabsorbed by those arachnoid granulations, where then it goes into those dural sinuses. And then eventually, as we already saw, from there, they converge and eventually end up in the jugular veins, and that's how they return to the blood circulation. So here is a diagram to show all of this. So up here are your lateral. Now this is just showing the right, but you've got your lateral ventricles where you've got some of the choroid plexus. You're producing from both the right and the left the CSF. So here you can see that choroid plexus. You're producing, anyway, the central cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. That is going to go through from the lateral ventricles. They flow through this interventricular foramen right there, that little opening, and they're going to flow into the third ventricle. So here's the third ventricle. Now it's going to flow through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. Here's the fourth ventricle right here. Like I said, it's between the cerebellum and the pons, and here's the upper medulla. So this is the fourth ventricle. Now from here, it can either go down the central canal of the spinal cord, or it can go through what's known as the lateral aperture or the medial aperture. The median aperture It's going to flow. Some of it now can flow around the cerebellum, and it's going to flow through here, and then a lot of it either through the central canal or down along the outside, bathing the outside of the spinal cord, goes all the way down. When it gets to the bottom, it's going to come back up. So it's kind of like, oh, we got a little loop down here, come back up, flow around in that subarachnoid space. And this is where you've got those arachnoid granulations, where it extends out into this, the dura mater, where you've got the sinuses in there. So here's your superior sagittal sinus. And remember, you had the occipital, and those are all going to come around and eventually converge, and then eventually be draining back into the jugular vein. Like I said earlier, you make about 500 mils of CSF a day, but it's constantly, some of it's constantly being replaced. That's with the central nervous system. With the peripheral nervous system, that is everything other than the brain and spinal cord. Remember, with peripheral nervous system, when we use the term ganglia, or just one would be a ganglion, it's a group of nerve cell bodies. Sometimes you have a network of fibers. We also see this, the circulatory system, when we talk about a network of vessels. That's referred to as a plexus. And then when you have a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, we refer to that as nerves. With the nerves, we also have some other vocabulary to be familiar with: the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. All of these are connective tissue that makes a membrane and covers and protects. The endoneurium is going to be connective membrane that just surrounds, so it's connective tissue, it just surrounds an individual axon. And so typically if you have that axon, you're going to have this protective layer, it's endoneurium. When you take a group of those axons together, you kind of put them together in a bundle. We call that bundle a fascicle. And the connective tissue around that fascicle is called the perineurium. Now you take several of those fascicles and you group those together, so it's a larger bundle of all these fascicles, and that is surrounded by the epineurium. And that is what you would typically call the nerve, that bundle of them. So here's where you would call this a spinal nerve. Is it one individual cell? No, it's not. So if we go in the same order as before, if we look in here, excuse me, around, and here's an individual axon, and around it would be your endoneurium. That would be this layer of connective tissue around it, that membrane. You take several individual axons, you bundle them together, and you cover them, if you will, with the perineurium. And so this is now known, this bundle here of axons is a fascicle. So you have, here's a fascicle. Now you group several fascicles together, wrap them with the epineurium, and that is your nerve. In this particular example, it's saying the spinal nerve, but this would be your nerve. So endos around an individual one, a group is surrounded by the perineurium, and then the entire nerve is going to have the epineurium. Cranial nerves, they are attached to the brain. They are part of the peripheral nervous system, but you have to have nerves attached to the central nervous system. So they're attached to the brain, but they're not part of the brain, so it's part of the peripheral. They're responsible for sensory and motor functions to both the head and the neck, except there's only one that does extend beyond, below the neck. Some of these are sensory, some of these are motor, and some of them are mixed, meaning they have both sensory and motor nerves in them. There's 12 pairs of the cranial nerves. We tend to, once again, do more of the anatomy and the lab portion and more of the physiology in lecture. So we're just going to go through these. They do have names followed by a number, and you use Roman numeral. It's just tradition, the way it's been set up. If you start anterior and go posterior, you look at them. The olfactory, and then the optic, and then the ocular motor, and then the trochlear, then the trigeminal, the abducens, the facial, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, and then we have the vagus nerve, the hypoglossal, and the accessory nerve. The reversos and the numbering. Start on one end and just move down in order, and then flip back here. The spinal nerves, similar situation of where they're part of the peripheral nervous system, but it is the attachment point to the spine. There are 31 pairs of these. The spinal nerves come in. They have both sensory and motor nerves with them, and then they're going to separate. And so the sensory nerves will separate into what we call the dorsal nerve root, and the motor nerves separate in what we call the ventral nerve root, and that has the motor. There are 4 nerve plexus, or like I said, those networks of nerves. There's the cervical, the brachial, lumbar, and sacral. In this diagram here, to show these 4 nerve plexus associated with the spinal nerves. So you can see how there's groups of them. The lumbar and sacral plexus tend to innervate the leg, the anterior versus the posterior. And then the cervical tends to innervate the neck area, and the brachial will do part of the neck and down the arms.